Felix, no worries.
If you need an engineer, he'll be available, so.
Under a table. We're going to talk about that in the automotive industry at the moment. So my name is Ricardo Pagliarella. Pleased to meet you all. I'll give you a bit of my background. I started life with a degree in marketing and management because it was fashionable to do double degrees back in the late 90s. Mechanical engineering. So I grew up in a car family. I grew up in a garage with race cars and race bikes and stuff. I hung around for a PhD in aerodynamics and vehicle aerodynamics on some early intelligent transport system stuff with a view to energy reduction through slipstreaming on roads. I've done a whole heap of projects in Australia prior to tearing off overseas. My first taste of alternative fuel vehicles was working for Renault F1 team on the 09 car, which was the first year of hybrid vehicles in Formula 1. Lots of issues with cooling, which, if you've been following Formula 1 testing lately, are only growing exponentially as cooling systems for energy recovery get more and more intense. From Renault, I went to Tesla Motors, so I was involved for 2 years as a research and development engineer in aerothermal systems. So air over the car and everything from everything that needed heating up and cooling down, which is mostly the battery pack, the powertrain, and then other bits and bobs. You'd be surprised how much heat comes out of the 17-inch screen when it's not appropriately cooled. But my time there was fairly robust, 2 years, which is in Tesla time like dog years really. It's like 10 years everywhere else. Very, very fast-paced. Got to work on the end of the Roadster, a lot of development on the Model S and some of the other cars, some of which have reached production, so the RAV4 EV, whatnot, some of which we don't talk about because they're still secret deals. And we sign very, very, very firm contracts when we leave Tesla. So we can't talk too openly about what we did, how it went, and all that sort of stuff, but officially Elon is a really nice guy. From there I came back to Australia because family's family, mum and dad are getting old and all that jazz. And I work at Toyota Motor Corporation Australia. So we have 2 environment teams and a product planning team at Toyota. One environment team is based at the factory and is concerned with the capital investment at the factory for largely reduction of CO2 and related initiatives. We have an environment policy team that actually sits under corporate affairs. That's where I am. It's a silhouette of the energy affairs team in Japan, which is made half of economists, half of engineers. So we're about there, and we worry about how to guide the company through environmental challenges. We have a product planning team that deals with, as a subset of the policies and strategic initiatives that are made through the environment policy team that actually worry about which cars we bring in and how. So you can imagine there is a long list of available cars through our Japanese parent company. There is a technical link of sorts to sourcing powertrains and long-term planning for vehicle configurations through a technical affiliate over in Notting Hill, on Blackburn Road, and there's us that dictates how it's integrated in Australia. So I thought I'd come here today. Felix and Rebecca gave me a call and said, look, we've got people talking about conversions, and people can more be senseless about your stuff at Tesla and when it's Toyota doing an electric car for Australia and much of that jazz, but what can you talk about that's salient and important? And I said, well, very, very often among the old fuel community and also among mainstream, there's a degree of misunderstanding as to why we have or need electric cars and why they may or may not be coming to Australia in a rush. So I thought, let's take 10 steps back and run a presentation on a more widestream, more holistic carbon strategy. So let's step back as far as we can, even beyond the vehicle argument, and look at broader carbon strategies for the nation and challenges and see where vehicle electrification or alternative fuels and strategies for vehicles actually fit in. So when I present, it tends to be fairly interactive. If you want to interrupt me halfway through, just yell at the screen, put your hand up, whatever. I'll answer as best possible. But let's start with a question. If we want to put electric cars on the road, and they are exciting things, what's the actual mission? Is it to go electric? Is it to reduce our dependency on gasoline, what we call gasoline displacement? Or is it to reduce our net CO2?
All of them.
All of them is the popular answer.
What about money? Cost, running costs, maintenance?
Running costs is part of it. So I'd argue that EVs are way off being running cost comparable.
In anything that might bring the money in.
Government's not interested feeds into a wider part of carbon policy. There's a why is the government not interested?
No money.
But if we're interested in bringing EVs to market, Which one of these actually interests a company like Toyota?
The bigger picture would be the CO2. The small picture might be gasoline
Displacement? Who votes gasoline displacement? Hands up. You're in the minority. Who votes because electrics are cool? Who votes CO2 displacement? Yeah, all right, we all got it. Okay, so the whole point is to reduce that stuff, CO2. Well, in preparing this presentation, we've been doing an ISO 14001. We got environmentally audited all week at Toyota. So this is a series of picks, and I'll talk through them. I'm still a bit bleary-eyed from the audit. It wasn't fun. We got through it with flying colours, but we had new auditors, so not fun. Live with the pictures. CO2 is a real problem, and you all know why. We have lived about 120 years of automotive industry as a society without worrying too much about this, which is a real problem. What do we do in Australia to worry about CO2 coming from vehicle tailpipe emissions?
Nothing.
Who votes nothing? Great. Who votes Euro 4, Euro 5 standards type adoption? You're a smart crowd. We actually have people at work that we have trouble convincing this. We have tailpipe emission standards, so we're currently adopting a Euro 5 equivalent in Australia. There's a roadmap to Euro 6. This doesn't actually mandate anything to do with CO2 out of a tailpipe. These concern how clean, what volume comes out of your tailpipe is, not how much volume there is of CO2. CO2 is proportionate to how many hydrocarbons you combust. In the case of gasoline, isooctane. In the case of diesel, much longer, more complex hydrocarbon chains. But the standards that we have basically mandate how clean what that needs to be. So NOx, CO, other hydrocarbon emissions, particulates, all that sort of stuff. And this gets harder and harder and harder as we go. There's a separate argument concerning Euro 6, the roadmap and the implications for where EVs may fit in. But that's not what we're talking about. So, does Australia have a roadmap for reducing or mandating CO2 coming from vehicles? Who votes yes, we do? I mean, Europe's got one, America's got one, China's got one, Japan's got one. Do we have one?
Pre-September.
I'm talking, is there an idea? Is there something tabled in government today? Let's see how aware the crowd is. Correct. There is nothing. By 2015, the 3 largest markets in the world that will not have a fleet CO2 standard are Russia, Indonesia, Australia. We're in fine company. All right, so the standard, the global golden benchmark, and for those that have heard me crap on before, I apologise for going over the basics. The standard is to get under 100 grams per kilometre CO2 across your vehicle fleet as a manufacturer. And there are many ways to do this, and when you're done, numbers and how it's going to be done, what the mechanism for mandating it is in various countries, and how it's tested and whatnot, more or less we're sub 100 by 2025 in developed and regulated markets. How hard is sub 100?
Not very difficult.
Not very difficult. Don't work in product planning. A Camry hybrid, which is an exceptional car, 121 grams per kilometre CO2. That's homologated. So that's, when you run it through a test cycle with a calibrated robot doing the driving in a very Christian, my grandmother type manner. So we have homologation standards doing this, and we also have real world performance, which tracks slightly above that. When I say slightly, it's growing. Given that engineers are paid to be creative, I'm an engineer, I worked in racing, 500 of us paid a lot of money to break rules every day or to reinterpret them creatively. So passing a homologated standard is one thing, passing it in the real world is another. Who's got a petrol-powered car? Almost all of us would have had one at some stage. What the sticker says and what it does in the real world, very different things. All right. My former manager used to work at GM, and it was fantastic. I was like, how do you get these phenomenal homologated values out of a Commodore? He's like, oh, it's great. We take 20 development cars. We take tyres off one of them and cook them. So they're as hard as buggery. We run all 20 cars through a dyno, and we've got programs that work out which gearbox has the lowest internal resistance and which engine's got the best bearing, blah, blah. And we screw all those bits apart and assemble our best car. And we put it in a box and ship it to Spain, to Idiata, to the lowest rolling resistance, best tailwind in the world test track. And we get a number. And that's awesome. And that gets holding the number, basically. Toyota happens to be a little more real world, but we're still a while off. So we run the numbers in our team. The Camry Hybrid, for argument's sake, is 5.2 litres, which corresponds to about 119, 121 grams per kilometre CO2. But in the real world, we're tracking 6.2, 6.5. And that's a fairly short gap proportionately. The Corolla I drive at the moment, much worse. And so hybrids tend to have very good tracking to the homologated numbers. Diesel vehicles also very good. Small engines that aren't very elastic in response, you step and they go, whoa, what are we talking about now? Like low torque engines tend to have high fuel consumption relative to homologated values. But anyway, coming back to this. CO2, we put out a lot of it. 67% of the world's CO2 comes from 10 countries, including us. Not good. Where do EVs fit into this?
Just about not on the head for cars.
You reckon? Where do EVs fit into this?
They fit right in.
How?
It will allow yourself to, if you have a full fossil fuel electricity grid, you'll still have less CO2 with an EV.
I'm going to be, and excuse me, Tesla executives that are watching this in post-time, Toyota executives, I should say, I work for them now. I'm going to be a contentious arsehole and disagree with you. Okay?
But then you can grow your bloody grid with renewables. Now, a place like Australia, which we have bloody renewables growing, we're getting a lot better now. The best in Australia, South Australia, got wind at what, 27%?
You're 100% correct.
Good luck.
But there are challenges. There are challenges. And I'll give you a taste of the challenge as we talk into it. We have coal-fired power in Victoria. Not good. Agreed? But wind comes on in South Australia, and there's a link. And we all go, yeah. When wind comes on, does the price of electricity go up or down?
Also it goes down.
Up? Why up?
Because it's a class as a green energy, so it's more expensive to produce that on a smaller scale. If it was on a larger scale, the price per kilowatt.
So there's a payback argument, which is what you're alluding to. That's part of it. The other part?
The other part is they can't profit back the coal-fired power station.
Because they have extenuating contracts. That's part B. And part C?
Storage. You got a small
storage.
grid. You can't send all that wind energy to Victoria because they've got a small.
There are congestion charges. Many of you are going, Jesus, shit, that's really not quite good for renewables, is it? There's a lot of stuff. Right, so we'll segue into this, all right? We will get some. We will get there. So if we go, this is where we live, Australia, all right? And if we ignore that, I've callously left Tasmania off the map for a very good reason. They're wonderful with renewables, so they're not.
They always do that to us.
Yeah. Look, when you start accounting CO2 in a very, very hard way, Tasmania becomes an interesting case because it's like, we have, hydro, and that's awesome. And it's like, guys, that's fantastic. Like, during the day, it's like a big battery. Water goes down the hill, and you produce electricity, and your net CO2 is bugger all. But at night, when our coal-fired power plants still have contracts to produce electricity, it goes back up the hill thanks to coal-fired energy in Victoria, which is,
Could we buy it from you cheap?
Correct.
You can't sell it to anyone else.
That's right, because there are supply contracts. So if we look here, particularly here, there, not much data up there, ignore this for a minute. Take a Nissan Leaf, current darling of the EV world, because it's the closest thing, it's the first real car we have for sale in Australia that's purely electric. I'm not going to class the Roadster because there are like under 15 of them. I'm not going to class the IMEV, sorry IMEV owners, it's not really a car. It's more a jumped up quadricycle than having the safety and space and whatever it wants. There's going to be a war after this, I know, but it is a very good product for what it is, but it is a very, very early adopter product. The first mainstream car to hit the market in Australia that's all electric, for all intents and purposes, is the Nissan Leaf. And the Nissan Leaf is kilowatts per kilometre. Anyone? About 0.18, so 180 watts a kilometre. Sound about right? Homologated value. So we have that same argument of, does the homologated value really track what happens on a hot summer's day with air conditioning and wanting to get from A to B quickly? No, it doesn't. It is more efficient when you add to things, and there is better elastic response, so the tracking is actually closer to homologated values in practice. But let's go with the homologated numbers, plus 10%. How much CO2 running off the Victorian grid per year do you think that spits out?
depends if it's natural gas or coal-fired.
We have numbers that carbon factors can weighted average across the grid. And I'll throw some numbers out at you. To make a Camry, not a hybrid, a base model in Australia is 10.4 tonnes embedded CO2 before you start driving it. That's highest of all 8 or 9 Camry plants around the world, owing to where our energy comes from. We're still debating whether we go cogeneration. It's been a big project of the Altona factory, and that would have cut a good 23% off that. So that's more or less the effect of that grid. So there's that much, and driving a hybrid Camry at the homologated values plus 15%, so 15 on the hybrid and 10 on the electric, rounds out to the low 3 tonnes per year, ballpark. How much for the Leaf? More or less? You'd like to think.
Tell us.
It's in the 4s. Right? So it's still tracking about 25–30% above. And that's not a comparable car. If we compare it to a Prius,
Due to what?
due to the carbon intensity of producing energy on our grid. So this creates a massive, massive problem because, let alone the hybrid Camry, if we talk about this car, the Leaf absolutely gets smashed for net carbon. So if, as a vehicle manufacturer, we're concerned with reducing our CO2, so corporate social responsibility through a CO2 reduction, if all the cars we sold tomorrow were electric, we would actually be doing most Australians a disservice. And that's a real problem on a number of fronts. Laws in America and in Europe for CO2 abatement of vehicle fleets, so that whole 99 or sub 100 by 2025, rely on a number of mechanisms to increase or accelerate the sales of electric or alternate fuel vehicles. So you have the zero emissions mandate in California. You have rebates on electric cars through a lot of America, so you get $7.5 grand back in your pocket as an incentive to buy things. There are no incentives out of the EU, but what there are super credits. So there is a limit that comes down per year for vehicle fleets, and if you sell an EV, it counts as a number of cars rather than one car. So there's a regulatory mechanism to incentivize selling these cars. And taking 2 steps back beyond the vehicle fleet argument, you can do this because there's nuclear power in both those regions to varying degrees. So Californians talk a lot about the sun, but there is a rather large facility at San Luis Obispo that does a lot of the grid energy for California. Renewables are very, very diffuse in many of those regions, extremely diffuse, there's good take-up. They don't have this whole coal-fired power problem like we have. So what's the incentive for the government? You'd have to ask. We talked about the government's not interested. What would be the incentive for the government to run electric vehicles in a very diffuse manner tomorrow?
I think if there's international pressure for trade that would force them to
force their hand, and that's an important argument. So the guys from Bloomberg Energy Finance, Bloomberg has now a news service just dedicated to energy affairs, make a fair point, because this is something that we ask a lot. The current government's not climate change. We don't really say that, ixnay on the climate change, all that sort of stuff. That being said, carbon is a bit like a pendulum. You will have to deal with it sooner or later, and it'll come back with a fair amount of inertia. Given all the trading blocks we're involved in do have fleet CO2 agreements, do have extenuating agreements on carbon performance beyond the automotive industry. And beyond the automotive industry is an important argument to appreciate. What happens for cars is a subset of what happens regionally. About 2.5–3.5% of the EU's CO2 profile comes from vehicle emissions. Not 20 or 30, 2.5–3.5%. So there are broad policies, and there is what happens for vehicles that sits within it. But you're right, because there are broad policies, and there's a lot of noise being made in Australia on the lack of broad policy or deleting broad policy, but we're in business with countries that deal with a lot of broad policy. It will come back. Either this government or the next. We'll have to. It will be a condition of trade. What else? What do you think about that? For vehicle manufacturers, that's an important argument, because a vehicle model cycle is 5 to 7 years. So that Prius will stay, like in Australia, for 3 years, get an update, new set of wheels, new tail lights. You'll notice the current one does actually have new tail lights. This is the pre-update model. No Prius fans? You should have all been screaming. But 5 to 7 years. And we plan that in very, very sharp detail 2 years in advance. It takes about 3.5 years to build a car. To develop a powertrain from scratch is about 8 years standard. So a 10-year perspective, even in Australia, is actually worth taking, because beyond 2017, we won't have any engineering nous left in the country, so we'll be accepting and planning against other countries' engineering direction what vehicle powertrains we take. And if we don't get the plan right a long time in advance, from a vehicle manufacturer perspective, we could end up in a significant spot of bother. Does everyone understand? This is why you're seeing many vehicle manufacturers that you wouldn't have thought bringing electric vehicles or plug-in vehicles to market. Laws can change faster than product cycles can change to accommodate. It's that simple. So Porsche will be bringing out the Panamera plug-in. Wonderful car. At that price, when you're paying over $250,000 for a car, $3,000 extra to make it a plug-in is really not a concern. But the homologated CO2 value goes down from this to this. And the average CO2 value across Porsche's fleet becomes phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal. Which means they don't have to subsidize or madly increase the price of a Porsche Turbo, because the CO2 that creates is subsidized by this plug-in vehicle. BMW is looking to bring in plug-ins. VW has just reversed a decision to not bring in electric vehicles to Australia. So the Golf EV, the Golf GTE, their plug-in hybrid, which is an awesome-looking car for those who've seen the specs, and the VW ER, which is my favourite of the new bunch, would all seem to be back under consideration for Australia. Our laws may change.
If we're so far behind the regulatory process, could we then be a dumping ground for what they can't sell anywhere else?
No. I'll give you an example why. What makes a Camry hybrid hard to sell? Why?
Customer.
No, he's right. Price, first one. Because look, I'll give you an example. When I used to work at JB Hi-Fi, so when I was a younger wog, shaved head, muscular, anyone that did car sound about 15 years ago at JB Brighton would have seen me. It was fantastic. I sold more 15-inch subs than any JB rep anywhere in Australia. If you came in saying, I want X brand of subwoofer, amplifier, combination of the rest of it, but we had spivs, we had incentives on Kenwood, the best brand in the world in that time that you would buy was Kenwood, and you would walk out the door with that. So you imagine a value chain, and this is important not just for Toyota, but for any seller of vehicles in the country, where hybrid is an option. The value chain from the car is made all the way through, it walks out, someone walks into a dealership wanting to buy a car. The incentives on hybrid vehicles generally are lower than for petrol vehicles, because hybrid vehicles cost more to build. So the last time I gave a presentation, you might want to find it on the ATA website.
Is that a volume thing?
No, that is simply a what goes into them thing. To make a hybrid vehicle, you need everything that you need for a petrol vehicle, plus a battery, plus this, plus that, plus the other. So the costs are additive. To make a plug-in hybrid vehicle, plug-in hybrids are the most flexible thing going. I love them. I think they're the future of Australia, at least in the short and mid-term. The road to acceptance is paved with plug-in hybrids. However, everything you need on a hybrid, plus an onboard charger, a J1772 or Shademo, or whichever way you go, plus, 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 plus. When you get to electric vehicles, the cost structure diversifies again, because if you're building electric vehicles off petrol platforms, the embedded cost is quite high. If you're building electric vehicles off dedicated platforms, the embedded cost becomes much lower. See Tesla with the Model S, much lower cost than the Roadster, trust me, I know the numbers. Also BMW with the i3, top example of a car that was designed ground up to be electric or electric range extended. But you're also taking a massive corporate risk in doing so. So you have to be either a very big or a very brave company to try and do as much. And those two brands I've just mentioned are good examples of either. Right? So hybrids are hard to sell because they cost more.
One thing I actually can't really just require is that if you do the embedded energy for the total life cycle, it's actually not much better than any ordinary forward sort of petrol vehicle.
And that comes into the number of components in it. So we talked about the Camry Hybrid was 10.4. The Camry Hybrid adds about another ton, which is dependent on how it's made. If you notice Tesla's not too brave about putting out an embedded CO2 target for the Model S, and I don't know whether it's been accounted or not. It wasn't an active project when I was there, to my knowledge. But you would imagine with a rather large battery made from a very disparate supply chain. Tesla does vertically integrate a lot, but the batteries are made elsewhere and they're dug up God knows where and put together in a foreign plant. So there's things to control there. Beyond that, the car is made in aluminium, or just set America aluminum. And for that, the stamping procedures are higher. There's more embedded energy accordingly. You have to be very, very, very responsible as an automaker, and this is where the i3 is actually a very good example. The i3 is made with the intent of being carbon neutral as it leaves the factory. BMW makes their carbon themselves in a subsidiary factory in, I think, Washington State. I could be wrong, but it's all hydropower. The assembly plant is powered by 4 Norco 2.5 megawatt wind generators that feed direct back into the grid, so they can account that way. It's a full composite chassis, so they've replaced welding with bonding, they've replaced forming with molding. These are lower energy intensive processes. But this is, again, stepping back and back and back and back and looking at a carbon perspective.
Why don't they just offset?
Offsets are a really, who said offsets? Who? Offsets are a really, really, really tricky argument. Because an offset is trading money for performance, which is fine. But aside from trading money for performance, it is trading money for a largely intangible aspect of performance for which there is very little regulation. Right, so it doesn't make a sellable proposition.
So in an ideal world, it would be benefit. In reality, it's hard.
Well, the picture that we're building up is that if you want to be a niche manufacturer and dump 300 EVs on the Australian market a year and sell to cashed up hippies and whatnot, you don't have to deal with these questions. But if you're a significant manufacturer, you have beyond carbon accountability, you have corporate social responsibility accountability. So you better come to market with something that answers the CO2 problem beyond having the EVs themselves. But one reason governments might be interested in things, and we'll get to this picture, which makes you very excited, partly it's the electricity network. So can we charge cars off the current EV network? Yes, no. We all win EV tomorrow.
No.
Why? Infrastructure is not quite set up. We don't have any demand response management capability. So if we all charge at the same time, no, definitely not. Right? We can't do it. We don't have enough information as a community, enough policy information to work out what are we charging in our bills.
And some of those grid areas, you actually can't drain that much power down that actually line in that short time.
There are provisioning issues, okay, but we abate this with schedule, for which there are standards in development. And I've been involved in some of the Standards Australia stuff, which is all very exciting.
Combustion engines for 100 years. Only EVs haven't been going that long. Well, not commercially.
Not commercially. You'd say the first cars were EV, and then they all went to sleep.
But as far as Victoria goes, I understood that we produce in Morwell, they've got the furnaces going all night doing this burning coal because it takes 12 hours to heat up. There's a whole lot of waste there going. So surely Victoria might be a good place to start because we've got all this burning coal that's just being wasted anyway.
Economically, it's a tough argument. I'll explain why. We have, as a society, gotten far, far, far more responsible, whether you like EVs or otherwise, about using electricity. So our baseload electricity is actually dropping, which is great, you'd think. And our peaking demand, because your kids have PlayStation 10s and whatever else, is increasing. So the peak use does this, the baseload use does this, which means there is no slated need to replace our baseload energy sources. There's no need to invest in it. If you're a provider of energy, you have to invest in peaking power. These are very expensive power plants that will kick on within 30 seconds of there being demand.
Tasmania.
Every Tasmanian I meet at these conferences is like, ha ha ha, not our problem. Get a leaf, carbon abate that, have a nice day. But everyone else is sort of like, for the 500,000, but we go away. You're statistically insignificant in this argument.
The problem with that is getting less rain, so actually starting, one of the companies that invest in hydro actually starting to look at wind.
Yes.
Actually realising they're going to run out of rain soon.
Eventually they will, global warming being what it is, or they'll run out of a net enough of wind to keep sufficient growth in that energy, in that energy profile portfolio. But essentially, because in Victoria we have diminishing baseload demand, coal's not going away anytime soon. Right, it's the baseload that's the problem. It's not the peaking demand. If there was sufficient peaking demand to justify wholesale additions to baseload, we could make some very green choices.
I've worked in power generation for many years, and with peaking power stations, they're great, especially on natural gas. But there's a 2 to 3 year waiting list for new gas turbines worldwide, and the other alternative is to purchase second-hand ones. But then there again, you've got to spend money on
Yep.
refurbishing them. So we live in a society which is very power hungry. So we're just starting to join the train.
Yep.
And the train's going to take a long time before it comes into the station.
You raise a good point. If you think the automotive industry is slow, deal with the power industry. Their cycles are considerably longer. So this picture...
10 years for nuclear.
10 for nuclear.
15.
Try 25. And so 25 is about what we're due to replace, or talk about serious replacements for our coal-fired stations, I think, at current life. So we're about due for that debate as a society now-ish. You know, it's coming up. But we're Toyota, we don't deal with, you know, we're not going to build a nuclear power station anytime soon in Australia. So for the level we can diversify, we could, don't doubt it. It's a matrix management thing. This picture becomes important. So how many of you got solar? Oh, you lovely people, wonderful. Okay, so if your leaf argument at 4-ish tons a year, if you're putting 8 kilowatt hours back into your car 4 days a week, all of a sudden your leaf is at around 1.5 tons a year. And that's bloody wonderful, isn't it? Now we're heading in the right direction. And this is a move that we're seeing globally from grid-based power sources to off-grid power. And off-grid power is really important because it gives you the freedom to be intelligent. So how we deal with this as a vehicle manufacturer is, rather than pushing electric as an agenda or fuel cell as you know, any one solid agenda, we need to build cars from a variable variety of power sources and let consumers make informed choices against their market conditions. Australia is a unique place in that both grid electricity and bulk hydrogen wheel-to-well performance for CO2 are horrible for what we have at the moment. So off-grid becomes really, really, really important. Problem with off-grid, and some challenges we'll talk about, and when I say these are challenges and it's good to start the discussion, this isn't a draconian discussion. This is actually really expensive. So payback for this is in the 8 to 9, you know, 8 to 10 year mark, and most people fleet their cars at 3. So there's some opportunities we need to talk about in policy. Maybe we're not so interested in abating the cost of the cars as we are abating the cost of this to make it pliable and viable. Maybe we're interested in, instead of owning a battery with your car, that your battery is least independent of your car, so you're guaranteed performance of a critical part of your powertrain that reduces CO2. Yeah. Maybe we have to talk about very, very significantly off-grid energy storage. And the cheapest way to buy batteries is from car manufacturers. We actually make them more than anyone else. Currently, the supply chain for used batteries in Australia is starting to become Second Life. So we do have 20-year hybrids. We do get batteries back. There's usually one cell's gone a bit duff, but you know, you're talking taxis in Darwin that have done 450,000 kilometres. And the battery is not performing acceptably for vehicle use, but it's more than suitable for off-grid storage. Absolutely more than suitable. So we have that kind of thing. Do you need off-grid hydro at home? Pump water up, pump water down. But when you can do that, when you can tie your energy source to your vehicle, and you use that as a policy set, that as a solution set, the net CO2 becomes very favourable for electric cars. Very, very favourable. That's a party trick you can't do when you're running off gasoline. Fuel cells, complementary or competitive for the EV agenda? Game changer, game changer. You see as competitive? Good, I'm a more receptive audience. This is Toyota's corporate agenda. We do fuel cells as many others do fuel cells. The cost of, the powertrain cost of a competitive EV and fuel cell vehicle are about the same now. Fuel cells, if there is a breakthrough in diffusion barrier membranes or whatnot, they currently use a lot of platinum. They can be replaced with plastics. Fuel cells will tumble in price a lot quicker than any technical advancement slated for the moment in EVs.
Just make a concept proof now of a much lower cost membrane that's not.
When I say that's great, and I shrug my shoulders in a very different way. Engineers are wonderful at coming up with great ideas. Lawyers are great at pushing for patent encumbrance. I'm an engineer. Yeah, we come up with great ideas. Patent encumbrance is a bit of a sticky, sucky thing. So you can't have nickel-metal hydride powered EVs of significant battery range because the patents are all tied up above a certain battery size. So if you want to go full EV, you're basically stuck with lithium-based technologies. which have their own set of challenges. Not impossible, but their own set of challenges. And the challenges go from thermal management to CO2 performance and embedded whatnot to resource depletion, to any number of things. Fuel cells are nice though, because if you want to go for longer range, you just add a bigger tank. They're a bit difficult in that we don't actually have a distribution network for hydrogen yet. And we certainly don't have a distribution network for, and this is the fine print, hydrogen of sufficient purity to let your car run for the intent of its design life. Like any very, very, very purely distilled element, if it has impurities, it will F up the system it's running in quite well. And fuel cells, automotive fuel cells at the moment, rely on a very high grade of hydrogen. So the cost is very high and supply is very low.
Where does that hydrogen come
from? This comes from the wheel. This is the wheel-to-well argument again. So wheel-to-well in Australia, not so good for hydrogen. In fact, we can do better making hydrogen on small scales, from local solar sources and local reforming than we can in bulk at the moment. That's a big, big, big challenge for us.
You go back to the same source of energy.
Absolutely, you do. Coal gasification is, one potential solution with CO2 sequestration, and there are arguments around that, some of which are very serious and social arguments. America has a different problem. They've got more shale, so they can break up hydrogen from there a lot easier than we can, arguably. Japan has a different agenda. So Japan is a country trying to rapidly wean itself off nuclear power for many policy and social arguments. But we are talking longer timescales. So in metropolitan Japanese cities sponsored by vehicle manufacturers, we're not talking about diffuse hydrogen refilling networks till 2030 in a very early adopter market. So it will be complementary from that angle for the moment. It will also be complementary in that at the end of the day, we're only talking an EV with a way of building a battery or an energy store on. The other thing it shares with EVs is vehicle to grid. Vehicle to grid, everyone familiar with vehicle to grid? We should say more energy export. So the ability to put energy back from your car into either a local grid, into your home, so V2H, or into the net grid. This is a hot area of regulation in Australia at the moment. As you can imagine, if we're building up the correct policy picture, you should be starting to get in your heads that one of the barriers to acceptance of EVs, non-fuel vehicles, is being able to generate your own electricity and pumping it into your cars accordingly. Right? And that's the best CO2 perspective we have at the moment. It starts to get good if you can export that energy back out of your car and into your house, or back into the grid at high export rates, or higher export rates, export tariffs that we have at the moment, but particularly within your house. If you were building a commercial building, you're doing commercial solar installation, tri-generation, you'd need a reverse current relay so that if the grid goes down, you can keep producing power and anyone working on power lines doesn't get killed and all that sort of stuff. Not yet quite as regulated for homes, but it's an important thing to get right as a society. So we need to start getting some sort of involvement. When I say we, vehicle manufacturers traditionally don't deal with this. We've never had to sell the fuel bowser along with the car, or worry too much about what Shell, whoever else does. But to get this right and accelerate acceptance, we need to. And if we go back to that global CO2 perspective, and this picture is meant to symbolize perspective, that's really the point. If you look at it just from an I want EVs perspective, it really doesn't make sense. You bang your fists against a brick wall where no government will actually hear you. Because today, from what bulk mechanisms we have, and I say bulk mechanisms in terms of Toyota, Nissan, why don't you, bring in EVs in bulk numbers? Well, because we look at the market in bulk arguments. We look at what everyone wants for a car, whether you're a Nissan Patrol or Land Cruiser driver, all the way to a Yaris or Micra. And how many of you want EVs? Well, without segmentation in research, you're not going to get very representative markets, or very, very representative answers in very nascent, segmented, but homogeneous growing markets. You're all here, you all have strong answers. How many of you have solar? Most of you. How many of you want an EV? Most of you, all that sort of stuff. This is a very homogeneous market. And that's a very rare thing for vehicle manufacturers to deal with. How many of you want EVs to be subsidized by government policy? All of you, but take a step back is what I urge you. Take a step back and look at the broader carbon challenges the nation faces, broader carbon policy challenges the nation faces, and then look for solutions within that context. And if we do, we talk about off-grid power generation and flexibility of choice in what you fill your car with to move forwards as very, very key elements of accelerating the market. This is something we've not had to deal with either, which is why my job, Sustainable Mobility Policy Manager, only existed from January 1st this year. And they're still looking for involvement within the company in a big way. And so we're still growing the space of that, or the reach of it, into our product planning groups, into our vehicle homologation people, into our policy people, into how we talk and deal with Japan. The answer from our Japanese parent was actually very interesting. They said, well, you naturally have involvements with universities for research, don't you? And we said, not really. Ricardo's a bit of a nerd and he deals with 1 or 2 master's students, but not much else. And I said, well, you should, because we make the cars to fit all sorts of answers. But how you implement it in your local market deals on some very, very peculiar regional sensitivities. We are in a no silver bullets age of motoring when it comes to being responsible with energy management. No silver bullet means a lot of thinking, means a lot of understanding, and that comes at a local level.
One of the biggest problems in Australia is that the needs for your city-based market is far different than your rural.
Absolutely.
And currently,
and 20 years ago, whether you lived local or whatever, we all used to drive Commodores.
Yeah, but I mean, your city market can handle the ranges of the current EV, but it doesn't go beyond that.
No, I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, we talk to people about the plug-in Prius is an interesting one because it's a car that I believe still has a lot of relevance in the right specification at the right price, despite the fact that the EV frame or the grid-connected vehicle frame is changing significantly. So you have cars coming to markets with different build specifications, different packaging specifications, different battery sizes, different range. And we have trouble convincing our own people that 25 kilometers is actually sufficient range. So they say, well, what about the Volt? The Volt has 60. The Volt's the best car General Motors has ever built for a client that it doesn't exist. The Volt would cost easy 10 grand less if it had a 20 kilometer range and not a 60 kilometer range. But if your argument is just going, oh, well, if why you bought the car is to travel solely with as much electricity as you can, yes, then range anxiety becomes a problem with plug-ins. Well, I mean, if your argument is actually to abate CO2 or to displace petrol, 25 kilometres, 2025, for most people, we did this study quite extensively in the States, with 130 Prius plug-ins, is exceptional.
I live in the outer suburbs like Hillsville,
yeah.
So the nearest railway station would be 30 kilometres away.
That would be fine.
That's a walk, isn't it?
Well, for 25 Ks, you know, you do very little. So we have 5 cars out with GoGet Car Share at the moment. You may have seen them. They're ludicrously coloured.
I have the charging network in Melbourne. It's all in central Melbourne. There's no actually plug-in.
No. You raise a really, really important point. And I promise with the perspective picture that I've mentioned to myself, before we talk about how to build the charging network, before we talk about what specifications it should have and where it should all go, that we've got to get a head check about why we're actually doing this and how we're going to go about it. Because from then these technical solutions flow. So I agree. I think we've made some really choices for where the charging network goes. We've got 1 or 2 chargers in high-level city locations that are catering to a fringe interpretation of a classic paradigm of using a car. Whereas if we actually took 10 steps back and said, look, we want to abate carbon, we want to deal with people that live in Seddon, live in Healesville. These people that like green solutions tend to cluster. They're aware of what a train looks like, how to use it, and if the carriage is full, the CO2 profile of transport goes down. We know that it's hard to roll out charging infrastructure in the city because you've got to tear up the sidewalk and there's permits and red tape and all this sort of stuff, and the grid is already stressed. Yep. And then which charges do you get? Do you go for your U-Butte brand new Siemens 70 amp level 2? Do you listen to people saying the Leaf can now do 6.6 kilowatts AC? Isn't that bloody fantastic? Do you say, hang on. We want to increase diffusivity. We want to drop CO2. How do we do that? Well, the train network's already there, so we want to get people driving a fairly low emissions vehicle to a train station and getting on a train. And to do that, we want them to charge their car while they're there, because these plug-in cars for the moment are going to be the lowest CO2 way of doing it. If we can get some solar, if we can get whatever. Now, we can't have a lot of solar. This is a thought process I'll get to. Right? We can't have a lot of solar because the stuff costs money. But if the cars are parked there for a long period of time, we actually don't need that much to make a serious impact on the CO2 profile. So we don't need mega fast chargers. We need to accept that you work 8 hours a day plus 2 hours travel. So we need to accept that a car will be plugged in there for 10 hours. That brings the cost of the charger down. Because you're talking about a park and ride or a train station, the cost of putting in the chargers goes down quite significantly because because you're dealing with local regional councils, you're dealing with people that give less of a stuff about tearing up the sidewalk. Policy becomes easier, rollout becomes easier. If we target places where people live that are already interested in these cars, uptake becomes easier. And all these sort of things flow on. But if you don't take 10 steps back and look at it from a CO2 policy acceleration perspective, you don't divulge these solutions. Right? I had an existential argument with some dude here the last time that was on about, I want more fast chargers because I'm a country boy and I live somewhere around Shepparton, I think, and I have a Leaf, and I need Shademo everywhere. And I was like, dude, that's great, you know, but you're statistically insignificant, no offense. You know, so 1 or 2 chargers for you around the place is great, all right, and that's fantastic, but, you know, you don't represent our everyman. You don't represent your biggest chance to accept that. It was on video for the last time, but he wasn't very happy. So, look, he had a point. You know, he said, I use the Moreland charger very, very, very often. And the Moreland charger is a classic example of trying to use the only hammer we've got in terms of rolling out vehicles. The Moreland charger is like, here is 50 grand to roll out vehicle charging. Week 1, mega excitement. And, you know, Stu Nesbitt over at Moreland is a legend. He is an absolute eco-warrior. I love it. Very well measured. He's got his head and heart in the right place. And he's connected. All right, so week 1. Week 2, which chargers? Where do they go? Week 3, well, 2 little chargers, we get charge rage, you know, like how do people plug in? Too many of them, and well, I see cars parking, and one of an EV comes along, oh, how do we measure this policy? By week 8, it's like, stuff it, we'll put a DC fast under an alcove and call it a Halo project. A year into it, we'll park the Leaf around the corner because Nissan's told us that the warranty's void if you fast charge it more than twice a year. And that's exactly what's happened. Right? So his argument was like, I'd love a second one, so that if another person just like me comes to Moreland, we can charge together. I was like, dude, hey, there's the statistical likelihood of there being a second person like you, even though you're an influencer, relative to the growth we need. Yeah, relative to the growth we need is small. So we do need a DC fast charger for people like you, so that for the half hour you need it, you can come into a region and then charge off a sort of network. And that's important. But where you invest the next dollar for the best return in growing the market is not there. It's in that argument. Sorry, go first.
I can see a future where we have a good public transport system, and then when you get to
you got some rose-tinted glasses. There's some people laughing around down the front.
When you get to close to your destination, you hop into an electric car, self-driving. You just take you the 10 or 15 K. And then at the other end you get out and it just goes back to base or stay there for the next vehicle.
It's all possible. No, I mean, there's a lot of EV manufacturers doing work into autonomous driving just for that purpose. If you look at Tesla's recruitment pages, they're recruiting a stupid number of people in autonomous driving at the moment. So there's clearly a move forward. Autonomous driving isn't so much as the key as driving smart. So intelligent transport system arguments are largely formed about better driving. If you're driving safer, if you're driving eco, they tend to correlate with each other, and you're consuming less energy net. So we're less concerned with whether people want to drive or not. In some cultures, the uptake though is sensitive to other factors. So the autonomous Leaf was shown off, you know, in Japan recently. Interestingly, Akio Toyoda, our president, went there and said, "This is bloody great," you know, without saying we have projects too. Aha! So you got to drive. But a Chinese reporter, female Chinese reporter, said this is what Chinese women need. This would be a boon in our country. Because we haven't grown up with a culture of cars, so we don't give a shit about the driving experience. What we give a damn about is doing makeup in the morning. The car just gets us from here to there. So autonomous driving would accelerate your uptake of EVs, autonomous or otherwise, simply because we can do makeup in the morning.
Yeah, but I sort of mean that the electric cars could be not just fine. You don't have to actually own them.
We have car share at the moment for that. Aside from the autonomous part, I understand that GoGet is kind of working autonomous vehicle uptake as well, and so are a few others. We actually do have car share networks. But you've got to take 10 steps back and say, okay, how do we get the cars there? GoGet's actually not paying for the cars that we have, because we get data from them. So we don't know where you're going, because they don't want us to take GPS data. But all the vehicle usage stuff, I can tell you what you had for breakfast in the car if you're ringing up a day after you've driven it. That's important to us. But if we had to lease that car to GoGet, we would need a significant policy argument, either that subsidises us or that justifies it from our end, to make that lease competitive with the very little amount of money they currently lease a Yaris or a Corolla for. Guy down here was next.
Yes, I think one of the solutions to our problem is lacking a distributed network of power supplies where we can plug our cars in. So I think what we should be doing is convincing our governments and our small communities to invest money into small distributed networks, either from solar, natural gas, and also tip gas, where we can then get a variety of power sources into a generator and then produce that power on a small scale. And the next community can have their own distributed network, and that can plug into the larger network. And so once we've got a network, then the manufacturers can build their cars to suit our networks. It's only a matter of plug and play at different voltages and different types of power.
What's your name?
Ken Winter.
Ken has summed up the essence of this picture. Low-hanging fruit and beware the lemons. That's an excellent argument for Australia. That is a good fit for this country. As
And
an
they do that
extent.
in Europe, where the small communities generate their own combined heat and power.
Mm.
We can produce our own power on a smaller network and then provide that service to people who want to come and live in that community and purchase and use electric
And I'll
vehicles.
finish it off from a vehicle policy argument. That allows electric grid-connected vehicles to be used as an instrument of a broader CO2 reduction policy. And that's the correct argument. It's not EVs are awesome, we're hippies, mung beans and banana peels. It's CO2 reduction.
Yes, and a lot of gas power generation engines now are low NOx and low CO2
Yep.
because they've been manufactured and designed in Europe, where they're far ahead of us at the moment. So
Well, we've got a friend that works for Caterpillar, and he's like, when we take those engines to Chinese sites, the air coming out of them is cleaner than what goes in. ironically.
GE bought an Austrian company called Back Gas Engines 8 or 9 years ago because they couldn't compete with the technology that these Austrians were producing, so they decided we'll buy them. And they're manufacturing and putting these engines all over the world.
We're going to have to end up there.
End up. Bloody hell, 2 slides. I'll be quick, so I'll chop you off. Low-hanging fruit, off-grid, and get your houses pre-provisioned to at least connect. That much is easy, and EVSEs are coming down. I'll be super fast. The last slide is just very smart. Sly reference to nuclear, maybe. That's not intended, though. The point is, it's not about EVs. It's about choice. It's about being intelligent. It's about reducing CO2. And if EVs are an instrument to get you there, that's a good thing. And it's an avenue that I and the company I represent definitely supports. Thank you for your time. Any questions anytime, I guess, even afterwards. Way
Might be
afterwards.
outside.
Outside. No worries. Cheers. All.